Racist woman dumped food on Big Shaq and shouted, "Go back to Africa," right in the middle of a joyful community fair. The crowd went silent. Cameras came up, and what Big Shaq did next wasn't loud, wasn't violent, but it changed everything. In a moment soaked in hate, Big Shaq chose something bigger, and the world wasn't ready for it. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sky above Atlanta was a canvas of soft blues brushed with warm gold, and the kind of breeze that made the trees sway like they had something to say. It was the sort of Saturday that made you forget the week's worries, when life didn't feel heavy, and even the oldest grudges loosened their grip. It was a day built for joy, not the loud kind, but the kind that settles in the chest like a slow, grateful exhale. Shaquille O'Neal, better known to the world as Big Shaq, moved through the winding lanes of the suburban outdoor food fair, with the quiet ease of someone who belonged everywhere but never asked to. Dressed in a faded gray hoodie stretched comfortably over his frame, a pair of black joggers, and old-school kicks, he walked like he wasn't one of the most recognizable faces in America. He wasn't there for the cameras, though plenty found him anyway. He was there for the people, for the stories, for the kind of humanity that doesn't come with a price tag or sponsorship. Every few feet, someone called his name, a teen in a wheelchair flashing a peace sign, an elderly woman holding a framed photo of her late son, who once played high school ball with dreams as high as Shaq's jump shot, a street artist sketching fast but with heart, hoping to capture the likeness of a living legend. And to each, Shaq responded with that same soft laugh and nod, the kind that said, "I see you, you matter." His narration, though unheard to those around, colored everything he did. They think being big means you have to push through the world, he thought. But sometimes being big just means you gotta make more room for kindness. He stopped at a stall selling lemonade in glass mason jars, paid double, and told the kid behind the counter to keep the change. Then he posed for a photo with a toddler who didn't know who he was, but liked the look of his size. Moments like these weren't rare for Shaq, but they were never routine. He carried them like snapshots in his soul. Across the street, a small brass band played jazz, so raw it made your feet move before your head decided to. The fair was alive with color and rhythm. Families laughing, kids with cotton candy, the smell of barbecue laced with fried dough and cinnamon. It was the kind of event that reminded folks of what community could look like when it wasn't broken. But in the middle of that warmth, something colder stirred. Just behind a modest food truck parked on the edge of the square, someone watched with a gaze that didn't match the atmosphere. Her name was Brenda. She was in her mid-50s, with silver strands tied back into a bun, so tight it could have been made of steel wire. Her apron was clean, her hands busy wiping down the counter. But her eyes, those were... Brenda's barbecue bites was a new addition to the fair, set up just 6 weeks earlier. Locals hadn't quite warmed up to her ribs, but she'd held her ground like a stubborn tree in poor soil. To the regulars she was polite, distant, and always a little too quick to judge. But no one had seen her like she was now, still as stone, watching Shaq like he'd brought a storm in his shadow. Shaq hadn't noticed her yet. He kept walking, sipping lemonade and waving at someone calling his name. But that quiet tension had already entered the frame, like a shadow at the edge of a well-lit photograph. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it was present, waiting. The fair's MC stepped on stage to announce a raffle. Kids cheered, adults clapped, and somewhere in the distance a balloon popped, making a few heads turn. Shaq smiled at a boy with chocolate on his face, and handed him a fresh napkin. Then, without planning it, his eyes scanned the row of food trucks, and landed on hers. Brenda didn't flinch, didn't blink. She just kept wiping down the counter with a slow, methodical rhythm, like she was scrubbing away something invisible. Shaq's gaze lingered a moment longer than usual. Something about the way she stared made him pause. Not in fear, but in a quiet knowing, like he'd seen that look before, not from her but from others. In locker rooms after racist taunts were hurled under breath, in boardrooms where they praised his philanthropy but never invited him to the after-party, in airports where they asked for selfies and then clutched their bags tighter. It was a look that said, "You don't belong." Not really. He nodded gently and moved on. But the moment had shifted. The warmth was still there, but now it carried a question mark. 10 minutes later, Shaq stood in line at a popular soul food truck run by a woman named Geraldine, who had been cooking for the community since before Shaq ever made his first dunk. He ordered collard greens and sweet potatoes, his comfort meal, and waited patiently as Geraldine told him a story about the time he signed her grandson's cast. She handed him his plate, and as he turned to walk away, a sharp whistle cut through the air. It wasn't the kind that called for attention. It was the kind that dared someone to look back. Shaq turned. Brenda was standing outside her truck, holding a full plate of food in one hand. Brisket, beans, cornbread soaked in sauce, and for a split second, the fare went still. No music, no chatter, just her voice slicing through the air like broken glass. "Go back to Africa," she said, loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. And then, with mechanical finality, she flung the plate at his chest. Time did not slow down, not in the usual cinematic way. It didn't have to. The silence that followed made every second stretch. The food hit his hoodie, with a wet slap, sauce staining the soft gray cotton, like a wound. The plate clattered on the pavement, beans sliding across his shoes. A child gasped. Someone dropped their phone. Shaq didn't move. He didn't flinch. He stood there, hands by his sides, breathing slowly. Eyes not on the food, not on the mess, but locked with hers. And for the first time, Brenda looked uneasy. She hadn't expected stillness. She wanted noise, anger, confrontation, a headline. But what she got was something else entirely. Shaq looked down at his chest, then back at her. Then, without a single word, he stepped back, wiped his hands on a napkin, and walked away. Past the crowd. Past the music. Past the cameras now rising from trembling hands. He didn't explain. He didn't justify. He didn't ask for anything. He just left. And that's when the true storm began. The video hit social media within the hour. No context needed. Just a quiet man, covered in sauce, refusing to bow to hate. Reactions flooded in. Shock, anger, praise. Big Shaq Grace started trending. Some called him a hero. Others demanded justice. A few questioned why no one had intervened, why no one had stood beside him in that moment. But Shaq's narration stayed with the audience like an echo. They want you to get loud, to strike back. But sometimes the loudest answer is the one you never give. The fair didn't shut down that day. Life continued. But something fundamental had cracked beneath the surface. Because no matter how bright the sun, some shadows show up uninvited. And now everyone was watching. The scent of smoke and spice hung thick in the midday air, the kind of aroma that pulled people toward comfort. Not the artificial kind, but the kind cooked low and slow, marinated in memories. Laughter bubbled from different corners of the fair as grills hissed, spatulas clanged, and the sounds of life filled the wide-open space. It was a feast for the senses. It should have stayed that way. Shaquille O'Neal ambled forward, drawn by a familiar smell, that distinct punch of charred meat, sweet glaze, and seasoned beans, the type of food that reminded him of Sunday kitchens, and his mama humming to Al Green. A small group was gathered near a truck painted in red and tan, its lettering bold but clean. Brenda's BBQ bites. He hadn't tried this one before. Maybe today was the day. Shaq waited his turn, hands casually in his pockets, nodding at those who noticed him but not in a way that made them feel smaller. He liked letting people be people. When the group ahead of him cleared, he stepped forward and met the eyes of the woman behind the window. Her apron was spotless, but her expression wasn't. Her smile came late, and not all the way. Something about it didn't match the music in the background, or the energy of the crowd. It was tight, like it had been stitched on for the sake of appearances. "Afternoon," Shaq said, voice low and warm. She looked at him as if those two syllables offended her ears. "You want something?" she asked, her accent southern but sharpened, stripped of hospitality. "Yeah," he replied, glancing at the chalkboard. "Let me get the brisket plate. Beans, cornbread. You got sweet tea?" "No sweet tea. Water's fine." He pulled out his wallet, but something flickered in her eyes when he did. Not the usual recognition, not the "oh it's him" look Shaq was used to, but something colder, deeper, personal. He noticed it. He always did. But he said nothing. She turned to fill the order, her movements fast and clipped. The fair buzzed behind him, music still playing, people still laughing, unaware that the air had shifted. She came back to the window with a plate in one hand, water bottle in the other, but instead of handing them across the counter, she leaned forward slightly, like she needed to make sure every eye nearby saw what she was about to do. Then, with a sudden flick of her wrist, she threw the entire plate onto his chest. The beans, sticky and hot, clung to his hoodie. The brisket slid down in a smear of sauce. The cornbread hit the ground near his shoe and crumbled. The paper plate landed upside down, catching a gust of wind and fluttering to the side like an insult carried off too easily. For a moment, nobody said a word. It was as if the fair had gone mute. The music faded into background noise. The clinking of cups paused midair, and even the sun seemed unsure whether to shine as brightly. Shaq didn't move. He didn't brush the food away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at his clothes. His eyes stayed locked on hers, steady and searching. Not with rage, with something heavier, disappointment, as if he'd seen this scene before, lived it in too many ways to count, and each time it still found a new way to hurt. She didn't flinch, not at first. She wanted this moment. She had waited for it. Go back to Africa, she said, her voice flat, loud enough to cut through the wind. That sentence, heavy with centuries, loaded with venom passed down like a cursed family heirloom, hit harder than the plate ever could. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Someone let their drink fall. A young couple pulled their daughter closer. The phones came out. A click, a flash, a hand shaking as it recorded. People didn't move to help. They watched, too stunned, too afraid of what came next. Shaq didn't give them what they expected. He didn't shout, didn't curse. He didn't throw the water bottle back or storm off with angry steps. Instead, he took a slow breath, closed his eyes for half a second, and opened them again. The hurt was there, but buried, controlled. Not for her sake, for his own. He reached into his hoodie's pocket, pulled out a napkin he'd kept from the lemonade stand earlier, and dabbed at the mess on his chest. He didn't wipe with urgency. He moved with the same calm he'd had all day, like he was choosing not to give this moment more than it already demanded. Then, with one last look, not of fury but of pity, he turned and walked away. The crowd parted like water around him, unsure if they should cheer, speak, or apologize on someone else's behalf. They did nothing. They watched the man walk, dripping in sauce and dignity, until he disappeared around a corner near the jazz band that never stopped playing. Brenda stood frozen, her hands resting on the counter's edge, white-knuckled and suddenly aware of the silence now gathering against her. She scanned the faces. No one clapped, no one defended, no one ordered from her truck. This wasn't how she imagined it would feel. But here's what nobody around her knew. This wasn't random. Brenda hadn't just snapped. She didn't wake up angry that morning and decide to take it out on a stranger. No. She had a history with Shaquille O'Neal, one that she never spoke of, one that wasn't public, but it lived in her bones like resentment she'd never managed to scrub clean. Years ago, her late husband had owned a small barbecue joint 2 blocks from where Shaq's foundation helped open a youth center and soup kitchen. The foot traffic shifted. Her husband blamed Shaq. Business dried up, and bitterness set in. When he died, not long after, Brenda didn't grieve. She simmered. She cooked that grief down until it thickened into blame. Not at the economy, not at poor decisions, at Shaquille. The symbol, the smiling face on billboards. The man she believed took everything. She watched him for years from afar. Every time he made a donation, she rolled her eyes. Every time he opened a school, she whispered curses under her breath. When she got the permit to open her new food truck and saw his name among the fair's community sponsors, she made a silent promise to herself. If he ever stepped to her window, she wouldn't serve him food. She'd serve him something else entirely. And she had. But hate, when served, doesn't go down smooth. Not even for the one serving it. As the crowd slowly resumed motion, Brenda realized she wasn't in control anymore. Her hands, once busy and certain, began to shake. She tried to return to cleaning, but the rag didn't feel steady in her grip. The next customer didn't come, and for the first time in a long time, she felt alone in public. Across the fair, behind the jazz stage, Shaq sat on a bench, food still sticking to his hoodie. He wasn't crying. He wasn't even fuming. He was just still, watching the sun dance through the leaves, watching a bird hop near his foot, pecking at the fallen cornbread. He knew people would talk. He knew the video would be everywhere soon. But more than that, he knew he hadn't broken. And that mattered more than any tweet or comment section ever could. As the sun dipped slightly toward its afternoon slant, and the food fair buzzed behind him, Shaq sat on a weathered bench tucked beneath a wide pecan tree. His hoodie was stained, sticky with sauce and beans, now crusting at the edges. But he didn't care. He didn't move to clean it off. His body was still, but his mind was wide awake. Not with thoughts of Brenda, or the gawking crowd, or even the viral video that was already beginning to spread online. No, his thoughts were somewhere far deeper, somewhere older. Some folks think history is a thing you read in books, he thought, eyes unfocused as he watched a squirrel dash up the bark beside him. But history ain't written down, it's carried. In your chest, in your blood, in your mama's stories and your granddaddy's silence. And so it returned. Not like a wave, but like a room slowly filling with smoke. The past didn't come at him, it just appeared, the way it always had. First came the face of his mama, Lucille. Strong, wide-cheeked, eyes like polished coal. Always watchful, always steady. She was never the loudest in the room, but when she spoke, the world tilted a little to listen. His memories of her were never blurry. She lived in him sharp and clear, like she'd never left his side. He could see her now, standing on the front porch of their old apartment complex in Newark, arms crossed, yelling to the neighborhood kids not to touch the fire hydrant until the sun was high. Her voice had weight, but her lessons had wings. She raised Shaq with a spine of steel, wrapped in velvet, dignity, always dignity, even when the world spat in your face. He remembered being 7 years old, when he saw her stop a man from screaming at a grocery store cashier for no reason. Other than her skin, Lucille had stepped in, calmly, asked the man if he wanted his change, or just a stage. He'd left, embarrassed. Shaq had watched her from behind the bread aisle, his small hands clinging to a bag of sandwich rolls. That day he'd learned more about power than any game would ever teach him. But it wasn't just lessons in grace. Shaq had felt the sting of racism early, even if he didn't always understand what it was at the time. He remembered being in 4th grade, when a teacher pulled him aside after class and said, "You'll probably be good at sports, not books, so don't get discouraged." He remembered being 13 and walking through a department store only to hear the soft click of security radio chatter following him from aisle to aisle. He remembered being called boy by a gas station attendant, when he was taller than the man himself. Lucille always told him, "You don't let their hate become your reflection. Let it be your fuel, but never your face." And he listened, because he saw what happened when people let it become their face. But of all the moments that flickered in and out of focus like an old film reel in his memory, one stood out sharper than the rest, the one that carved itself into the very grain of who he became. He was 15. It was late. They'd just come back from visiting his uncle, in South Georgia. Shaq had been quiet the whole ride, tired from the long drive and from helping unload the groceries at their cousin's place. His stepfather, Philip, an army sergeant, firm but fair, was driving. Lucille was humming low in the front seat, something gospel that Shaq couldn't quite place but had heard his whole life. They were only 10 minutes from home when the flashing lights appeared behind them. Philip sighed, already reaching for his license. Shaq didn't know why his stomach clenched the way it did, but it did. The officer approached slow, flashlight already on, tapping against the side of the window like he was knocking on an invisible barrier. Philip rolled it down, and kept both hands on the wheel. "License and registration," the officer said. "No greeting, no reason." Philip complied. The officer looked over the documents, then leaned in further. "Mind stepping out the vehicle, sir?" Lucille's voice cut in, sharp but even. "What's the reason, officer?" The flashlight moved off her face, then back to Philip's. "Step out." Shaq remembered his stepfather's eyes in the rearview mirror. Not angry. Calm. Trained. He stepped out without a word. What followed was quiet, but deliberate. Shaq craned his neck, heart hammering, as Philip was led to the back of the car, handcuffed without resistance, and placed into the cruiser. Lucille had to raise her voice 3 separate times before the officer returned to explain. Something about a matching description, something about routine questioning, nothing that made any real sense. They sat in the car for nearly an hour while Philip was questioned on the sidewalk, sweat dripping from his brow under the streetlight. Eventually, another squad car arrived. There was a brief exchange. Philip was released without charge. No apology, no explanation, just uncuffed and dismissed, like a package misdelivered. They drove home in silence. That night, Shaq stood in the hallway outside his bedroom, listening to his mother cry through the bathroom door. Not loud but deep, like the tears were pulling something from her soul. That was the night Shaq made a vow. Not to get revenge, not to build walls, but to never ever let the hate they met in the world become the legacy he left behind in it. Years later, when he became the icon, the athlete, the celebrity, he didn't forget that night. He carried it with him into every interview, every charity event, every school he visited, every hand he shook in the neighborhoods where kids were told not to dream too big. He wore it like armor, invisible, but unbreakable. So now, sitting under the pecan tree with sauce on his chest, and eyes watching him from behind phones and whispers, he didn't just feel embarrassed or attacked. He felt that same pressure in his lungs, that same silence in his mother's tears, that same shame in a system that too often asked the victim to stay polite, while it handed microphones to the ones who shouted loudest. But this wasn't about one woman's ignorance. This wasn't about a plate of food. This was about what gets triggered when old wounds are pressed without permission. Brenda didn't know it, but she hadn't just thrown food on a man. She'd hit a fuse tied to decades of quiet pain. Pain that never asked for sympathy, only space to breathe. And now that it was breathing, it was asking a deeper question. What do you do when your dignity is tested not by violence, but by humiliation? When the world tells you to clap back, but your soul tells you to stand tall? Shaq didn't have a final answer. But he knew the first step was to stay still. Still like the tree overhead, roots deep and unmoved, even when the winds came cruel. Still like his mama's hands, folded in her lap, while her eyes did the speaking. Still like history itself, always watching, always waiting, always ready to remind us that it never really leaves. He stood up slowly, brushing the crumbs from his lap, not his chest. The stains would stay a while longer. That was fine. Let them. Let the world see what was thrown. Let the world remember how he didn't throw it back. A woman in sunglasses pulled her daughter closer and walked away quickly, as if the very air had turned electric. A teenager with a camcorder-style grip on his phone kept filming, whispering to his friend, "Yo, did you see that? That was him. That was really Big Shaq." Someone else muttered, "That lady's crazy," under their breath, but made no effort to confront her or comfort him. Another man, perhaps in his mid-40s, in a corporate polo and jeans, lowered his phone and looked conflicted, like the weight of his own silence had begun to press against his ribs. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, then looked around, realized no one else was speaking, and so neither would he. It didn't take long for the phones to come alive. The footage was raw, unedited, jostling with background noise, gasps, the sound of food hitting cloth. Some caught only the aftermath. Shaq turning, food sliding off his clothes, the woman's bitter face still frozen in place. Others caught the insult itself, full and loud. "Go back to Africa." In some videos you could hear someone drop their drink. In others, someone could be heard giggling uncomfortably before it turned to silence. None of the clips lasted more than 30 seconds, but they didn't need to. Within 2 hours the first post hit 1 million views. By the 4th hour it had crossed 6. On Twitter, on Instagram Reels, on TikTok duets and YouTube Shorts, the incident fractured into hashtags and heated commentary. Big Shaq Grace. Food truck hate.
Handled like AK.
Why did no one help? The split in the response was immediate and sharp. Some praised him as a giant of restraint. This is what strength looks like. Others, though not many, offered shallow questions about provocation. But the most pervasive reaction wasn't judgment or admiration. It was confusion, guilt, self-reflection. Why didn't anyone say anything? That question began to repeat. In videos, in captions, in duets with wide-eyed influencers, expressing secondhand shame. It didn't take long for journalists to pick it up, community leaders to repost, psychologists to dissect. Shaq, meanwhile, stayed offline. He didn't respond. He didn't repost. He didn't even check the flood of texts pouring into his phone from friends, teammates, coaches, media personalities. His phone buzzed like a hive in his back pocket, and he was walking, away from the fair, away from the stage, away from the crowd that had shown him something he already knew. Not just that racism still dressed up in aprons and served food with malice, but that silence was often the real accomplice. Because in that moment, the crowd didn't throw the food, but they also didn't stop it. They didn't speak. And that silence, it wasn't new to him. He had felt it as a boy when teachers chuckled at racially coded jokes in front of a class. He had heard it in locker rooms where teammates stayed quiet when fans crossed lines. He had seen it in boardrooms where executives said, "We believe in diversity," but paused when it came to decisions that cost money or comfort. He walked until the fair sounds were a memory, until the sky above him shifted to a softer blue. He finally stopped near a small mural wall at the edge of the neighborhood. A painting of children holding hands, their faces all different shades, their smiles wide. He looked at it and saw something else, a question painted into their eyes, a question too big for hashtags. Behind him, the fair began to shift. Brenda had retreated into her food truck, curtains drawn. A few supporters had tried to approach, some offering half-hearted words about misunderstanding, others recording for their own safety. No one bought anything from her. Not that day, not the next. The city, though, had begun to pay attention. Local news ran the clip within hours, with captions like Shaquille O'Neal targeted in racially charged incident at Atlanta Food Fair. Public figures chimed in. Celebrities voiced support. A few white anchors tried to moderate both sides. A black pastor appeared on a morning show and said plainly, "The problem isn't just hate, it's the people who treat it like background noise." Shaq, however, didn't step into the discussion. Not yet. He wasn't ready. Because beneath the surface of that moment, beneath the food on his chest, the insult in the air, the silence in the crowd, was something he hadn't said out loud. Something he'd only begun to piece together. Brenda had known who he was. That wasn't a random act. It wasn't the wild lash of someone spiraling. There had been something in her eyes when she threw that plate. Not just contempt, but intent. She hadn't been surprised by who stood at her window. She had waited for it, and that made him pause. He remembered the slight tension in her mouth when he ordered. The too smooth way she said, "You want something," not as curiosity, as bait. She had history, not necessarily with him directly, but with what he stood for. And now he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, the hate, the act, the silence, was part of a deeper resentment, not just toward him but toward the change he tried to represent. The silence of the crowd, as hurtful as it was, felt familiar. But Brenda's aim, that was something different. Shaq made a decision that evening. He called an old friend, a former cop turned private investigator named Kellen. Trustworthy, quiet, loyal, a man who knew how to ask questions without alerting alarms. "Kellen," he said, standing near the mural, the sun now low behind him, "I need you to look into something for me." Kellen didn't ask why. He never did. And with that, the story took a turn. Not loud, not visible, but the kind that changes everything beneath the surface. Because this wasn't just about a racist outburst at a food fair. It was about the weight of silence, the memory of inaction, and the truth hiding behind a plate of brisket and a bitter woman's smile. Brenda Maddox had been called a lot of things in her life. Sweetheart when she was young and pretty, firebrand when her barbecue joint started pulling crowds, and problem when her temper became the part of her everyone remembered first. But few people ever asked why she was the way she was. Fewer still cared to dig beneath the surface of her polished food truck and forced smile. She made sure of that. From the outside, Brenda was just another Southern widow trying to make ends meet. She ran a food truck instead of the brick-and-mortar restaurant she once owned. She kept her silver hair pulled back, her apron ironed, her smile tight and functional. Most people who passed her by saw discipline, toughness, a work ethic passed down from generations who knew struggle. But the truth sat deeper, uglier, and entirely by design. Shaq had felt something strange the moment she'd looked at him. Not just hatred, but recognition. Not the kind that came from fame, but from something personal. It gnawed at him, even as the internet swirled in outrage and analysis. The moment hadn't been random. It hadn't been spontaneous. Brenda hadn't flinched when she threw that food. She'd done it like someone fulfilling an old promise, and that unsettled him. He needed answers, and when Shaq needed quiet work done, he called Kellen Ward. Kellen was a former cop, mid-40s, clean-shaven, quiet-voiced and slow to smile. He'd left the force years back, after getting tired of watching things get swept under rugs. Now he took private gigs, mostly civil cases, and background checks. But he still had contacts in the system. More importantly, he owed Shaq, not because of money, but because of a moment, years ago, when Shaq had helped keep his little brother out of prison by funding a rehabilitation alternative no one else believed in. Shaq met him in a quiet bar off Auburn Avenue. The place smelled like lemon oil and old wood, with jazz playing low in the corner. "She didn't just hate me," Shaq said after giving him the details. "She aimed it, like she'd been waiting." Kellen listened without interrupting. He never took notes in front of people, just nodded, then said, "Give me a couple days." 3 days later, Kellen showed up at Shaq's house, his eyes heavier than usual. "You were right," he said, laying a small folder on the table between them. "But it's bigger than you think." Inside were printouts, clipped articles, faded mugshots, Court records. Shaq sat back, the weight of the file already settling on his chest. He flipped the first page. Brenda Maddox, formerly Brenda Hale, had once co-owned a barbecue restaurant in rural Cobb County with her husband Randall Maddox. The place had been something of a local legend in the late 90s, known for its sweet hot glaze and Randall's open grill flair. They had a following, but then the city evolved, demographics shifted, and a younger black entrepreneur named Donovan Reed opened a soulful fusion spot just 2 blocks away. It was fresh, bold, vibrant, and it pulled the new crowd like a magnet. Business at Maddox BBQ dropped. Randall didn't take it well. Shaq turned the page. A blurry scan of a court record surfaced next. Brenda Maddox voted Reed Brothers. Smokehouse. A civil suit filed for alleged property devaluation after Donovan hosted a weekend event that brought a flood of new foot traffic and music to the street. Brenda claimed his patrons littered, disrupted her business, intimidated her customers. The court disagreed. The judge dismissed the case, citing lack of evidence and the presence of racial bias in witness statements. Brenda lost. And she didn't just lose the case, she lost the restaurant. Bills piled up. Randall began spiraling. Then one summer night, in 2007, Randall was found dead in his truck on the outskirts of Paulding County, officially ruled a suicide, though rumors circled that he'd been drinking, spiraling over finances, depression, and something else the cops never confirmed. Shaq flipped to the next page. His face hardened. A photo: Randall Maddox, 10 years younger, raising a beer at a backyard party. Nothing unusual, except for the small iron cross tattoo, barely visible on his wrist, and the man beside him wearing a shirt emblazoned with the insignia of a known white supremacist organization based in Georgia. Kellen had found the photo buried in an old public Facebook archive. It hadn't been scrubbed, just forgotten. "There's more," Kellen said, tapping the last page. Apparently, Randall had been quietly involved with a group calling themselves the Restoration League. A coded network of white nationalists who didn't wear robes or carry torches but worked in zoning offices, small-town councils, and police stations. Their mission wasn't loud. It was slow, strategic. A race from within. Brenda never officially joined. She never had to. She lived inside the grief of a man who had. And after he died, she picked up his bitterness, like a widow clinging to a coat that no longer fit but smelled like the past. She didn't shout in the streets. She just waited for a moment. One where someone like Shaq, big, black, beloved, walked up to her window and gave her an opening. It was more than hate. It was inheritance. Shaq closed the folder, his mind spinning not with outrage, but with the weight of what hate becomes when it's aged in silence. Brenda hadn't lost her business because of a market shift. She'd lost it because the world moved on and refused to carry her bitterness with it. And now she was trying to reclaim something she believed was taken, not just reputation, but relevance. But relevance built on resentment is a fragile thing, one that cracks when light hits it too directly. "She's not just mad at me," Shaq finally said. "She's mad the world left her behind." Kellen nodded. "What do you want to do?" That question sat in the air like thick smoke. Shaq didn't answer right away. He stood, walked to the back window, looked out over the quiet garden. Somewhere in the distance a bird called once, and was answered. Peaceful things still happened, even when the world seemed tilted. "I'm not gonna go after her legally," Shaq said. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" Shaq's voice dropped. "This is history trying to write itself back into the present. But I've seen this kind of story before, and this time we're not gonna let it end the same way." The local news segment aired just past the evening rush, slotted neatly between weather updates and a story about a kitten rescued from a drain. It was less than 2 minutes long, framed with pastel-colored graphics, and an anchor who smiled too much for the tone of the story. Brenda Maddox appeared on screen wearing a muted gray blouse, her silver hair pulled back tight. Her face was pinched in that carefully arranged expression people wear when told to look sorry, but not mean it. She sat beside her attorney, a man who did most of the talking. Brenda only spoke when cued. "I never intended to cause harm," she said, reading off a small cue card. "And I apologize to Mr. O'Neal for the misunderstanding." Emotions were high. It was an unfortunate moment. There was no mention of her words, no apology for telling a man to go back to Africa, no acknowledgement of the hate behind the act, no reference to history or wounds, just a vague handwave of regret designed to quiet the flames without touching the fire. Shaq watched the segment from his living room, remote resting in his lap, TV volume low. His face didn't change. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen, even after the segment ended. He didn't expect more. Not from Brenda, not from someone who had built their whole life around a truth they never questioned. He leaned back, letting the silence fill the space, then spoke to no one in particular. There's a difference between regret and transformation. That line stuck. Not because he said it loud, but because someone else in the room heard it. His goddaughter's older brother, Devin, who had been helping with outreach for Shaq's community center. Devin tweeted it an hour later. It went viral by midnight. Within days, it became a hashtag. People spray painted it on walls. Kids scrawled it on notebooks. Teachers used it as discussion prompts. Protest signs carried it through city halls. But Brenda didn't transform. If anything, she retreated. The backlash had ignited more than just attention. It brought threats, calls, messages scrawled on her truck in Sharpie. Some of it vile, some of it from people who meant well but didn't know how to respond to hate without returning it. And Brenda? She didn't soften. She hardened. She released another video, this time on her personal Facebook page, filmed on her phone. Her hands were shaky, her voice more defiant than apologetic. She claimed harassment, said she was being unfairly targeted. She didn't name Shaq, but the implication was clear. She framed herself as the real victim, a small business owner under siege by media pressure and public hysteria. "I made a mistake," she said, "but I'm not the monster they're making me out to be. I'm not racist. I've served everybody from every walk of life. I just don't believe in being bullied for one bad day." Shaq's team saw the video. His agent called him. So did a lawyer. So did 3 different nonprofit reps who wanted him to sue. Not for money, but for the principle. For the message. For the culture. But Shaq shook his head. "This ain't about me," he said. "It's about what hate costs." He repeated the words slowly, making sure the people in the room heard him. What it costs them. What it costs us. What it takes from our kids when they see silence win. He didn't want a payout. He didn't want airtime. He didn't even want revenge. What he wanted was understanding. A shift. Not just in Brenda. He'd given up expecting that. But in the way people reacted to hate without flinching into apathy or performance. That week, a school in DeKalb County invited him to speak at a student assembly. The principal, a woman named Rochelle Dunbar, said she wanted the kids to hear from someone who chose grace. Not as weakness, but as a weapon stronger than rage. Shaq arrived wearing a crisp black crewneck, clean jeans, no jewelry except his wedding band, and a simple watch. No team colors, no entourage, just himself. The gymnasium was packed. Kids sat cross-legged in the front. Teenagers slouched on the bleachers. Teachers lined up along the walls. Phones were out. Cameras pointed. They expected a speech about discipline, about pushing through, about rising above.
They got something else.
He started slow, his voice low but deliberate. "I'm not here today to tell you how to be better than hate. I'm here to tell you what it feels like to carry it when it's not yours, but somehow ends up on your back anyway." He talked about the food, the insult, the crowd that didn't speak. He didn't name Brenda. He didn't have to. He talked about history, about his mama's lessons, about the silence after his stepfather was taken from their car by police on a false stop, about how dignity isn't something you wear, it's something you bleed for, hold on to when people try to strip it from you. "You don't get to choose who hates you," he said, "but you get to choose what you become because of it." The room was quiet, not bored, not distracted, listening. He looked at the students row by row, face by face. There's a world out there that will ask you to be angry all the time. And sometimes, that anger's earned. But don't let them tell you it's all you are. You're not just pain, you're not just resistance, you're the reason we still hope. He paused, let the words settle. Then he told them what Brenda's apology had really meant to him. Nothing. Not out of bitterness. But because it wasn't real. And he wouldn't fake a response just to make others comfortable. He ended not with a quote or a cheer, but with a story about a boy who once saw his mother stop a grown man from yelling at a cashier. Not by screaming, but by staring him down until he walked away in shame. A boy who learned that day that silence isn't always cowardice, but it better come with a backbone if it wants to mean anything. The kids stood when he finished. Not because someone told them to, but because they needed to. A few cried. A few hugged him. The video of the speech circulated quietly at first, then louder. News stations ran excerpts. Educators requested copies. Parents wrote letters. Some said he sounded like a preacher. Others said he sounded like a man who'd been quiet long enough. But Brenda watched from home, alone, replaying the part where he said her apology meant nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize again. She simply stared at the screen like it had betrayed her. Because what she'd never prepared for was that the world might stop believing her story and start believing his. The air inside the auditorium still felt thick with Shaq's words, long after he stepped off stage. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel like absence. It felt like aftermath. A hush born not from politeness but from recognition. From the weight of hearing something too true to ignore. Students didn't rush out. Teachers didn't resume normalcy. People lingered in the quiet, like their feet had forgotten how to move. Shaq moved through the small backstage corridor, wiping the back of his neck with a towel, heart still heavy. Not from nerves, he didn't get those anymore, but from the kind of emotional purge that drained more than sweat. His body felt slow. His eyes burned not with tears, but with the heat of memory, recent, historic, personal. He thought the speech might empty something out of him, maybe even close a chapter, but what it did instead was open one. He stepped outside into the school's courtyard, where the afternoon light had softened and shadows stretched long. There was no crowd, no noise, just him and the wind, moving through the oak trees. That's when he heard small sneakers patter behind him. Mr. Shaq. He turned just as a boy, maybe 9, arms thin, face bright with effort, came running toward him. He wore a Spider-Man hoodie that was too big for his frame, and clutched a spiral notebook in one hand. Shaq knelt instinctively, catching him before the boy nearly crashed into his chest. The boy didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms tight around Shaq's neck and held on like he hadn't touched safety in a long time. Shaq froze for a second. Then he returned the hug, gently, firmly. The boy leaned in, and in a voice so small it felt like it wasn't meant to exist in the real world. He whispered, "You made me feel safe." That was it. Shaq had taken hits before, literal and emotional. He'd been mocked, misunderstood, underestimated. But nothing ever hit like that. That sentence cracked something inside him that had been held together by pride and patience. It wasn't about the food truck, the insult, the silence of the crowd. It was about this: what happens when one moment of choosing grace gives a child permission to feel human. He held the boy tighter for a breath, then let go slowly. "What's your name?" Shaq asked. "Trayvon," the boy said, eyes wide, like the other one. Shaq knew what he meant. And suddenly, he knew why the boy's mother had hovered so anxiously during the assembly. Why his teachers had stood closer. Why the boy had sat up front, legs swinging, notebook clutched to his chest like armor. Shaq placed a hand on Trayvon's shoulder. "Thank you for telling me that." The boy just nodded and ran off again, disappearing down the sidewalk, as his mother waved from a distance, tears quietly streaking her cheeks. Shaq stood still for a long time, long enough for the sun to shift again, long enough for something inside him to harden, not into anger, but into resolve. This wasn't just a moment. This was movement. Later that night, back at his house, Shaq sat with Kellen in the kitchen, the laptop open between them. The mood was low, but sharp, like the quiet before a hard conversation. Kellen had that look on his face, again, the one that meant the truth wasn't going to be clean. "I pulled some threads," Kellen said. "It's worse than you thought." He clicked a few files open, images and documents lined up in rows. There was Brenda's name again, not just on personal documents, but in campaign contribution records. She had donated a sizable amount, anonymously through a shell LLC, to a local councilwoman named Denise Hafford. The name wasn't familiar to most, but Kellen had recognized it. She was pushing a community unity platform in public, but actively working behind closed doors to kill a citywide diversity initiative tied to funding for youth programs, education access, and minority-owned businesses. "She's been blocking the vote every time it comes up in committee," Kellen explained. "But no one's noticed." Not until now. Shaq leaned back, processing. It made sense. Brenda hadn't just lashed out from personal bitterness. She had power in places that mattered. Small channels, quiet allies. She'd been positioning herself in a way that let her legacy live through policy, not just prejudice. "So all that noise about victimhood?" Shaq asked. "Calculated," Kellen said. "She's not just scared, she's strategic. The backlash made her double down, but not just emotionally, politically. Shaq looked at the screen again. Denise Hafford, smiling at a podium. Brenda's name in the donor ledger below. The same Brenda who had thrown food on him and told him to go back to a continent she'd never even studied. This wasn't just about personal ignorance. It was about systemic resistance dressed up as local politics. He stood up from the table, pacing slowly. "This ain't just a story anymore," he said. "This is a pipeline." Kellen nodded. "Exactly." Shaq walked over to the window and stared out into the night. His reflection stared back, a little older, eyes tired, shoulders broad not just from size, but from burden. But now he knew what he was carrying, and it wasn't just history. It was a boy's voice saying, "You made me feel safe." It was a generation watching how he'd respond, not just to words thrown like weapons, but to systems hiding behind smiles and suits. He turned back to Kellen. "We go public." "You sure?" Kellen asked. "Yeah," Shaq said. "Not for revenge, for clarity. People need to see how this stuff hides in plain sight." Kellen closed the laptop and stood. "What's the plan?" Shaq didn't answer right away. He just smiled, not out of joy, but out of clarity. "We're gonna shine a light so bright they can't even pretend not to see it." "No," Shaq said quietly. "I came to understand." She laughed. A cracked sound, all gravel and regret. "Ain't nothing here to understand." "I think there is," he said, stepping further in, the scent of burning ink and cheap whiskey curling around him. "I think you've been carrying something so long you forgot what it looked like before it hurt." Brenda wiped her face with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of ash across her cheek. "He wasn't sick, you know," she said suddenly, nodding toward the photos. "That's what I told people, that Randall died from something quiet, respectable." Shaq didn't interrupt. She stared at the flames. But he didn't. He was murdered. Shaq blinked. He hadn't expected her to say it outright. Brenda kept going, words spilling like oil. "Back in '07, he'd been drinking. Said he was gonna go settle something with one of them boys at Reed's place. Took his truck, drove out near the back alley where they'd unload. I didn't think he'd really do nothing. Just talk, bark a little. He liked feeling like he mattered." She paused, breathing hard. "They found him in the ditch that night. Head split. At first I thought hell. I wanted to believe it was one of them. Retaliation, you know. Tit for tat. Made sense in my head. Easy story." Her voice dipped. Quieter now. "But it wasn't. It was one of his own. Some punk from that damn league he was mixing with. Thought Randall was making them look soft. Said he was talking too much, dragging heat their way. So they shut him up." Shaq's jaw tightened, but his face stayed calm. "I knew by the next day," Brenda whispered. "They told me, said it was clean. Said we'd call it a suicide. Keep the message clear." She looked at Shaq then, really looked with eyes hollowed out by too many lies. "And I went along with it. I let the lie grow. I fed it. Because grief's easier to carry when you got someone to blame that ain't your own damn choices." Shaq stepped closer. Slow. "And so you blamed us," he said. She didn't deny it. Her chin trembled, but she nodded. "You walked up to my window, smiling, all calm, all respected, all intact. And I couldn't take it, not with everything I gave up. I thought maybe if I tore you down, I'd feel like I still had a piece of what I lost." Shaq's eyes didn't hold rage. They held something heavier, understanding. "I ain't never been your enemy, Brenda," he said. "You just got used to the shape of your pain and didn't want to let it go." She laughed again, bitter and soft. "Let it go? You ever lose someone and feel like it was your fault just for outliving them? You ever lay next to someone for 20 years and then wake up one day wondering if they ever really saw you at all?" Shaq thought of his mother, of the strength she carried, of the pain she never let define her. "I've felt like I had to carry things I didn't ask for," he said. "But that ain't the same as letting 'em rot everything you touch." Brenda stared at the fire. Only ashes remained now. "I ain't got nothing left," she whispered. "You got truth now," he replied. She looked at him, tears slipping down her face unchecked. "But truth don't love you back," she said. Shaq stepped toward the tray and picked up the last unburned photo, one of Randall and her, younger, laughing over a grill. He didn't hand it to her. He held it up. "Maybe it doesn't," he said, "but lies definitely don't." She nodded once, slowly. Her shoulders sagged, and her body seemed to shrink into itself. He turned to go. "You gonna tell him?" she asked behind him. Shaq paused in the doorway. "No," he said, "but it's coming out." She didn't argue, just sat in the smoke staring at the tray like it held her past, present, and punishment. As Shaq walked into the night, the breeze hit his face, fresh and cold. The truth didn't fix everything. It never did. But it unclogged the drain, let the poison spill out, so healing could even be possible. Brenda hadn't been innocent. But she hadn't been born bitter either. She'd been shaped into it by loss, by guilt, by the men she stood beside and the lies she clung to. Now the mask was gone. And Shaq? He walked away not with satisfaction, but with clarity. The real enemy was never just one person. It was the infection, the slow rot of unspoken grief and borrowed hate. And it was time to shine a light on every inch of it. The sky had shifted by the time Shaq stepped away from Brenda's food truck for the last time. It wasn't just the hour. It was the weight. The night air didn't feel cold or harsh, only honest. No cameras followed him. No reporters stood at the curb. No one witnessed the conversation but the wind. And yet what passed between them, the truth laid bare in ash and silence, would ripple further than any headline. He didn't walk fast. He didn't look back. But his final words to her, low and steady, were still hanging in the smoke as he left. "You can stay angry, Brenda, or you can stay broken. But you can't stay both." That line would land inside her like a slow drop in an empty room. Shaq didn't go home that night. He drove around the city for hours, windows cracked, music low, not to run from anything, but to digest it. Atlanta breathed with stories like Brenda's, quiet hatreds, old wounds, truths too painful to say aloud. But there was something different about this moment, something in the way Confrontation hadn't ended with fireworks, but with reflection. No dramatic outburst, no court date, just the truth uncovered and laid in the open. And sometimes, truth doesn't roar. It settles. 2 days later, Brenda's food truck was gone. Not moved. Closed. The awning had been folded up. The logo removed. The space she once occupied at the fair sat vacant. A flat rectangle of dry grass and grease stains. Word spread quick. She didn't post about it. Didn't announce a retirement. She simply disappeared from the scene she once claimed with such venom. But the streets were talking. Some said she packed up out of shame. Others said she'd been run out by community pressure. But those who knew what had happened, the real exchange, understood it was neither. It wasn't shame or exile. It was surrender. Not the weak kind, the human kind, the kind that finally admits something is broken. And if it's ever going to be rebuilt, it can't be made of the same old bricks. Meanwhile, Shaq turned his attention to something that had been quietly building for months. The East Side Community Center reopening. A project funded through his foundation to restore a historic building into a youth hub for art, education, and therapy. The center had been stalled twice due to budget cuts and zoning pushback, the kind tied to Councilwoman Hafford's hidden agenda and the shadow donors like Brenda. But that wall was coming down. Shaq had made calls. Kellen had quietly released records to the press. The connection between Hafford's donors and the diversity bloc made headlines. Petitions surged. Pressure mounted. Hafford's name trended for the wrong reasons. And she stepped back from the vote. The measure passed in city council. Unanimously. Construction restarted within weeks. By the time opening day came, the building was buzzing. Freshly painted walls, murals by local artists, a new garden space in back, planted with herbs and sunflowers. Kids lined the sidewalk. Parents clapped. Music poured from speakers mounted on temporary stands. And Shaq stood in front of the new sign, with his arm around Trayvon, the boy who once whispered, "You made me feel safe." The ribbon cutting felt ceremonial. But what mattered more happened after. The doors opened, and the people came in. Inside, classrooms glowed with promise. Volunteers offered tours. Teachers signed up on the spot. And in the middle of it all, quietly blending into the crowd, Brenda. She didn't wear her apron. She didn't carry flyers. She didn't say a word. She stood near the back of the main hall, hands clasped, eyes scanning the room like she wasn't sure how to be in it. She wore a simple navy sweater, jeans, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. She didn't make herself seen. She just showed up. Shaq saw her from across the room. Their eyes met. He didn't nod, didn't wave, but he didn't look away either. That was enough. She watched him speak to the kids, watched him walk with city leaders. She didn't interrupt. She didn't apologize again. She just witnessed. And that was something. Not redemption. Not absolution, but shift. In the days that followed, her name wasn't mentioned in the press. Shaq didn't go on TV to retell their exchange. He didn't publish an op-ed. He simply let the facts do the talking. A woman who once threw food and hate, now standing silently in a room built on hope, not trying to erase her past, but not hiding from it either. The community noticed. One mother said later, "That was the most powerful part. She didn't take the mic. She just stood there and listened." And for Shaq, that meant more than any headline. He met with the new leadership team of the community center later that week. They talked programs, outreach, mental health services. Before the meeting ended, Shaq shared something with them. "No victory means anything," he said, "if it don't come with change. Real change. Not just laws and logos. I'm talking people shifting in the bones. That's what this place is for." No one clapped. They just nodded. Because when truth's spoken from the gut, applause feels small. Outside, a boy tossed a basketball through a hoop, mounted on the side of the building. The net swayed in the breeze. A girl sat on the front steps, sketching with chalk. Two teens from the neighborhood argued about music. Life returned, but different, fuller. Later, Brenda would volunteer at a local food drive. Quietly, no cameras, just cans and crates, and short nods. She didn't wear her business logo. She packed bags and passed them out. Sometimes people recognized her. Sometimes they didn't. She never asked for forgiveness. She never claimed to have changed. But she started showing up in rooms where she once refused to be. And maybe that's what it starts with. Not perfection. Just presence. Just humility. Shaq didn't reach out again. He didn't need to. The work had already been done. Not with press releases or lawsuits, but with light. The kind that burns away lies without burning people to ash. No victory without change. And this time, they got both. He didn't try to manage the spotlight. He didn't attach himself to Trayvon's rise. He just showed up at his talks, stayed in the back, nodded when the boy caught his eye. Because that was what this whole thing had been about. Not retribution. Not even redemption. Just clearing space for truth to grow. And it grew. The diversity bill Brenda once tried to derail, the one wrapped in neutral language but designed to disqualify change, came back up for a vote in city council. But this time, the public wasn't passive. Parents showed up. Teens like Trayvon spoke. Teachers, business owners, pastors and youth center workers filled the gallery. And when the votes were cast, there was no hesitation. It passed. Unanimously. The funding flowed. Programs began. And suddenly, neighborhoods that had been redlined out of resources started getting in. Not overnight. Not perfectly, but steadily. Properly. And somewhere in the background of all this, never in the press, never in interviews, was Brenda. She never reopened her food truck. One day, without announcement, she donated it. Paperwork signed over to the local food justice program that fed families every weekend near the edge of DeKalb County. The organization didn't know what to make of it at first, but when they found the envelope taped inside the empty fridge, it made sense. Inside was a short, handwritten note. "This truck used to serve food. Lately it served something worse. Maybe now it can do better." No name necessary, but they knew. And they honored the quiet gesture the right way. Not with praise, but with purpose. The truck was repainted, rebranded, and sent out every Saturday with volunteers. It fed elderly residents, low-income families, kids on bicycles too proud to ask for help. And when it pulled into the lot by the East Side Community Center for the first time, no one cheered. They just lined up. Like grace wasn't about spectacle, just service. Shaq stood nearby, arms crossed, watching. A volunteer offered him a plate. He smiled, took it, and sat beside a man he didn't know, eating in the shade like he had nowhere better to be. That was the thing. He never wanted the story to be about him. But somehow it always found its way back. And so did the words. They came one afternoon as he sat with a group of high schoolers on the front lawn of the community center. They asked him what it all meant. The food fair, the insult, the silence, the aftermath. And he didn't prepare a speech. He just let the moment speak. "Hate tried to pour its sauce on me," he said, gaze steady. "But I didn't wipe it off. I let the world see it, so we never forget the taste, and never serve it again." The teens went quiet. Then one of them, a girl in a denim jacket with sharp eyes, raised her hand and asked, "What if people keep trying to serve it anyway?" Shaq smiled, slow and full of weight. "Then we don't eat." Laughter cracked through the group. Soft at first, then building. But beneath it was respect, the kind that doesn't need applause to feel real. Back at home, Shaq walked into his study later that night and saw something he hadn't touched in months. The hoodie, the one from the fair, still stained, folded, stored not to forget, but to remember. Not like a trophy, like a testimony. He picked it up, held it for a moment, then placed it in a frame on the wall.
No caption.
Just the fabric. Still marked. Still speaking. Because that's what this story had always been. Not a perfect arc, not a hero's journey, just a series of moments, missteps, reckonings, and revelations. A headline that could have become a wound, but instead became a mirror. And through that mirror, the city saw itself differently. Not flawless, not fixed, but finally facing forward. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it settle. Ask yourself where silence has been too loud in your life. Grace isn't weakness, it's resistance with roots. And the next time hate shows up dressed like a neighbor, be the one who doesn't look away.